Hello, reckless writers. We're back on world building, and today we're going to learn the secret lore behind Mel. I'm Argo.
I'm Mel.
And I am returning from the last episode. I'm Jim. Here's a plot development for you. I'm married to Mel. Stick that on your wiki.
What?
Not between the two episodes. It was only 5 minutes ago we recorded the last one. But this
Oh,
history.
don't tell them behind the curtain. We do this weekly.
I even changed my glass.
And this is writing without a license. So last week we talked about a general introduction to world building and got wildly into the reads. So we're going to bring it right back to the start, and I'm going to ask Jim, how do you make your world building unique in an already crowded market?
So when you're talking about world building, you are 9 times out of 10 talking about it in either fantasy or sci-fi. It's usually some form of genre fiction, because most other forms of fiction take place in the real world.
Yeah, the level of world building in speculative fiction is just leagues ahead of your modern day stuff, which is often why I do write the occasional modern day thing.
And so when you're writing in genre fiction, you're in a very crowded market, and the existence of tropes and audience expectations are both the strength of the format and its weakness. There are certain things that people come in familiar with. Some of them love them, some of them hate them. Some people, when you're 3 pages in, and they're hearing things like, and Andor walked up to the house of his friend Blondjaw, and they discussed the history of the realm of Tribadamdom. And it's very easy to parody because it's so common. So that's what you're competing against.
I know it's been said, as just as a general rule of thumb, is you'll never be able to think of any new way to spin elves and orcs. That unless you're absolutely 100% certain, you're going to find it really hard to sell that.
So I'd say you can't escape the tropes, but you don't have to use all the tropes. So what I'd say is there are certain things that it makes sense to have. But once you've got that, think about, is there some way you can do this differently? And it's kind of like if you have a very archetypal character come in to a story, and you could ask yourself something like, what if this character was not a man, but a woman? And you've already potentially got a more interesting character. Or they were much older, or they were much younger than what you're immediately imagining. And then you have another common fantasy trope of the the Eastern Kingdom that is clearly an analog for China. That's so common to be a cliche now. It's so much fantasy sort of repurposes the dynamics in our world. What can you do that is different to that without being so obviously different that it seems like you're just trying to make a point? Like, what if I had a nation where all the people had Chinese names but they were all white? It seems like you're just trying to be contrarian for the sake of it. For example, so it's a balancing act. But I think if you take every time you bring a trope in, think about if there's a way to flip it on its head, or do do something different with it.
Mel, I know you use some of the standard fantasy tropes in your books. How did you go about differentiating them to make them a bit fresher and a bit more unique?
Ooh. See, on one hand, I feel like I don't put enough thought into it, and then on the other, I know I spent forever thinking about which way round to have the genders of my protagonists. Like, I spent so long thinking about how that sits in with the rest of my world, and like what readers expect from fantasy books as well. So I'm not really sure, because I do employ a lot of them, and maybe I don't say enough with them sometimes, I think. Like, I read, in fact, me and Jim both read the comic Die recently, which takes so many tropes and just, like, spins them in a really interesting way, and that made me think, oh my god, I'm a failure of a writer, because I don't do that. But
See a previous episode for how to overcome that.
It worked so well for Mel.
Episode 4, I think.
we'll link it in the description.
That's work.
Yeah. I don't know. For me, I use a lot of established tropes that feel comfortable, but there'll be one or two that I'll be trying to do differently, and that'll probably be like the focus of the book, and I try not to worry about too much else. Or I'll try and, like, I guess maybe trope isn't the right word for what I do. I'll look at, like, a piece of myth that I feel hasn't been explored enough, and that's what I'll be interested in. I'll delve deep onto this one little thing, and then the rest, it just happens. It's fine.
I mean, that is a good way to differentiate yourself with the trope, is often it ends up feeling more like a trope, and more like a trope in the negative way, when it's only a shallow thing, when it's thrown in and not really explored at all. Whereas if you go deep onto it, if you're like, okay, I have orcs, but you know what? This book isn't just, oh, the orcs are just happen to be there as the bad guys. It's like, I'm going to go deep on orc society and how a society based on these ideals would work. And you take it that each step further down, you ask why this is the case, why this is the case. That opens up more a bigger realm of parts of that trope that haven't been seen before, which makes it more unique and still makes it interesting.
Or maybe you take some elements of the trope, you take some inspiration from real history perhaps, but you slap some big layer of fantasy onto it that morphs it. So let's just take an example from my RPG world. There's a very clear analogue for Japan in this world, in that it's a sort of isolationist nation near a much larger nation. But I sort of took this idea of the sort of the isolationist idea, and I thought, so what can I spin on that? And so I thought, well, rather than having it be to the east of the big empire, what if they're right in the middle inside a giant lake, but for some reason no one has seen them till the last 100 years? What reason could that be? And so I just sort of ran through some ideas, and the one I eventually came up with was that the lake is over geothermal vents, so it's boiling hot, it's misty all the time, and there's rocks that no one can see under there. So these people have just been sort of isolated on this island for ages until they got until their weathermancers became skilled enough to clear the mists and leave their own island and meet the people outside. So there I've definitely sort of pulled in some sort of fantasy tropes there. I've clearly taken a real been inspired by a real sort of nation, and they sort of D&D has this probably problematic long history with sort of taking peoples and turning them into fantasy archetypes. But and I tried to do that, but in a way that's a bit more interesting and hopefully less lazy and outright insulting.
Oh, definitely. And I feel like one of the other ways of making your world building feel better is, and I know I mentioned it briefly last episode, of how it ties into the plot and the characters. By making the individual bits more personable, it creates a new level of interest, and it links again to the deepness. It all links together in world building. That to make it interesting and to make it different, it's worth asking why and taking it outside the realm of where it starts and linking it to your character, linking it to the plot, linking it to the bits that you haven't seen.
I want to emphasize that this does not mean like literally stating it for your reader in lines, though. Like, just to remind prospective writers that
I did wonder about that though, because sometimes I think it's better to just have the narrator just explain something to you than to have a very forced line where a character says, now that these two nations are at war, these last 7 years have been really hard and grain prices are through the roof.
it depends
also,
on
I miss my mum.
it depends on what you're trying to communicate to the reader, though. Like, there's a similar thing with D&D in that a writer is playing a game with their reader in how they should communicate something. And if it's something that's like really precise, like a war, then perhaps you would be better than to tell them in narration than the cliched bit that you just did, that you just gave us the example for. But sometimes, like, the issue is that the narrator will then get carried away and tell you far too much, and the reader gets bored because the characters aren't talking anymore, and you need to be careful of that. Or they're giving you information that's not important to the story yet, and it's just like, why am I having to sit through this? And then in other examples, you're being told things that have already been pretty obvious, and it's just like, thanks.
Sometimes it's just about trusting your audience, I think. Especially when, like, so maybe when the first Blade Runner film came out in the 80s, maybe the sort of cyberpunk idea was not as familiar, so maybe it needed that paragraph of text at the start to explain the state of the world. But when Blade Runner 2049 came out a few years ago, probably didn't, because cyberpunk is everywhere and there's already been one film anyway. They probably didn't need that paragraph, and it just sort of takes you out a bit. If they just trusted the audience to pick up on, yes, there's flying cars and robot people, they'd probably waste less time.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the main advantage for using tropes. And whilst, yes, you know, your story should be a certain degree of unique, tropes, they act like shortcuts of by introducing, oh yeah, okay, there's flying cars, there's this, that, the other. The reader automatically kind of knows what to expect from these things. They don't need to be told about, oh, futuristic society, there's robots everywhere. What are robots? They know straight away. They know every trope linked with robots, so that you can focus on the interesting bits and not have to go over old ground.
Maybe a question to ask then is, what is your favourite world in a story? Regardless of the story at the core of that, what's your favourite world behind it?
I'm going to struggle with that one.
I have an answer of my own if you want time to think. But
Yeah, well,
sorry, Mel, I interrupted you.
I'm always for buying time.
Because I'm reading a series of books at the moment by Michelle Paver, where I feel like she's done world building really well, because it's about like ancient European survival, and they're all living in clans, and it's just so interesting because I haven't seen any other books writing about that kind of lifestyle. And so every time like the narrator jumps in and tells me that this is how the clans live, and it's just like a throwaway line, I'm like, oh, I'm like jumping on it, and it all stays really coherent throughout all the books. I'm rereading book 5 now, and I've just spent the whole time being completely impressed at how much research she's done, but also how imaginative she's been with other elements, because it can't all be based in history, and she's quite clear about that in her like essay at the end. And I'm not See, I love Mistborn's world, but like it doesn't feel nearly as cohesive as what I'm reading at the moment, which we did discuss in last episode. I mean, it's hard to say because I know a lot of it is taken from history, and it's sort of like an idea of how our world could have been in the past. Like you can almost believe it, but at the same time, it is still stunningly built, I feel.
Feel like one of the bits of world building I love best about Mistborn comes in the Era 2 books, where we're seeing a world 300 years after the events of the first trilogy. And you get to see how things have changed and how things are developing. And the books themselves are set on the time of like massive development, allowing you to see society changing over 10 years still, or over 2 or 3, I think. And I feel like it's such a strong aspect of world building to see how it's all developed and how it's getting closer to our society, but equally different in different ways. But it's a more unique aspect because it's benefiting from a whole prequel trilogy. Whereas it's not really something you can fold into your own books unless you're on book 4.
There's something in like both our descriptions there that matched, and that's that we were both interested in how a fictional world has similarities with our own. So in Mistborn Era 2, it's the culture is becoming more like Earth, maybe. Whereas in the Chronicles of Ancient Darkness, I'm looking at how maybe our world could have lived like thousands of years ago, like people like us, and it's based in Earth's geography, and I'm like, oh, this is great. So I feel like maybe an element of recognizability somewhere in your society. It should have something humane, if not human, about it.
I think one of my favorite worlds is sci-fi. It's actually from a video game, but I think there's some very talented writers behind it, which is the world of the science fiction game Mass Effect, which I would say doesn't have any unique selling point that I could say in one sentence. This is why this is an interesting world, which is not convenient for this. But what it does have is like bits that to the average player never matter, but if you're like me and you're the kind of person who reads all the codex entries that come up, are really cool. Like all the technology clearly has some grounding in science, and they're thinking about what this kind of sort of technology, how this kind of technology could feasibly work. And I find that really interesting. And that manifests in little funny, interesting little ways, like one of the overhearing an army captain telling his troops who've just got on a new ship that if they're going to fire the cannons, make sure they hit their target, because in space, the cannon will keep going forever. And as he says, somewhere, sometime, you're going to really ruin someone's day. And that's just like, I take that as one example of something just on the side, but it shows they've thought about the science behind it. Like I was saying earlier in the last time about how the reader doesn't need to know everything, but they appreciate knowing it's there. When I see stuff like that, it makes me feel like I'm in good hands. I'm in a writer who's thought about the world they're trying to create. And that gives me hope for sort of where the story's going to go as well.
A similar experience, and still on the realm of video games, I always feel is the Fallout series, where, like say, throughout the game, you could just ignore it all, but if you go through and read all the different bits here and there, is Fallout set in a world several decades after the nuclear bombs went off. So when you're going through each town, you're finding the last records of everyone who's there, and so many people leave a note or leave a voice record, and you get to see how so many different people approach it in different ways, or the few years leading up to what happened. And you'll go through and you'll see skeletons in one particular room in such a fashion, and you'll find the note next to them, and you'll be like, oh, I get why they're there now.
Environmental storytelling. Yeah. So I guess in that case, going back to what was said about the personal, the best audio logs are the ones that feel like they tell a personal story you can connect to, whilst also teaching you something about the world. The weaker ones are the ones where someone's just for some reason decided to talk into a TV and say what's happening in the news that day or something. That's the less stuff that's less convincing, isn't it? I think maybe hopefully tie some of the rambling I've said this time and last time together. A bit of advice.
We don't worry about that here.
Some advice I'd give. We've said don't just tell your readers all your lore. Yeah, fair. But one something you can do for yourself is do put it into writing. So what I do when I'm starting a new RPG world is I write like a guide to it, not necessarily for my players. I actually do run D&D for a pair of 12-year-olds who are adorably enthralled by the world I've created, so they actually do read my do read the lore I write, which makes me feel very privileged. But even if they weren't interested in that, I would say do it anyway, because I came up with so many of my ideas whilst just putting this sort of writing this stuff down. And what we were saying about the if this is true, what else is true? You just keep writing. You start to come up with stuff that builds on the world. Whereas if you just have your basic ideas and try to write your story and bring the stuff in, there's a danger you're sort of learning it as the characters are, and you sort of have to adapt facts about your world around your story. Or the opposite, where you've established something early on, but your story isn't going in a way that makes sense, so you need to change your story. Sort of think about the world separately and just document it so you can go back, because it's a really good thing to inspire you. It's just rereading what you've written.
I'm feeling...
Especially in... Oh, sorry, go on, Matt.
Just going to say, I'm feeling really cold out here, because... I am very much fly by the seat of your pants when I write at the moment.
I feel like there's room for both, and some of that comes down to the type of story you're writing. A adventure-based one where you're going to explore the world a lot more. It's very valuable to have already a bank of ideas to pull on and a bank of ideas to expand on. I know your first book, Mel, was all set in one small village, so you didn't need legions of world building. And it was a small village in our world, just at a particular point in history, which then allowed you to focus on just a couple of key things of, this is how the magic works. This is why this person is here. And the building around a small town you did plenty of. You just didn't need to explore much further out.
I know there are some people who make their own wikis for their RPG campaigns.
Oh, yeah.
George R.R. Martin has admitted to occasionally using the fan wiki, the Song of Ice and Fire fan wiki, to check facts about characters that he's forgotten.
That could be me in 20 years, if luck shines down upon me.
Well, I know Sanderson has someone employed full-time to check he's getting his facts correct.
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm like, I think that's the aspiration.
Yeah.
One day. One good software, in case anyone wants to know about that, is something called, I think it's called Wiki Notes. I've not tried it myself, but your mileage may be good with it.
One thing that we talked about, we discussed the various benefits and problems with shoving maps at the front of your book. A fun exercise for a creator is to make a map. If you're a fantasy writer especially, because like writing about the world, it helps to think about the world. And when I've made maps for my RPG world, I start to think, I have huge spaces between the important places. And so I think, well, I need to fill it with something, put some mountains here. Well, if there's a mountain there, then there'd have to be a river here. Maybe the river flows into a few lakes. Eventually that river would probably connect with the sea. So near the sea, there's probably some kind of coastal town. If this is a large port, they're probably quite prosperous. Maybe there's some villages along the way, so on and so on. And then you start to think, by thinking about a map, you literally start to think about geography and think about things that you don't appreciate until you're writing them, how important they are, like how long it takes characters to get from one place to another. So if you take Lord of the Rings as an example, it's important that it takes a very long time for them to walk to Mordor on foot. It's actually kind of surprise at the end when he says, 13 months ago I left, and you think, what? I'm pretty sure the films were longer than that.
At least the directors to cut. And with those wise words, that's all we've got time for.
Sorry, I was going to sum up there and just say, I was going to say, draw maps, write lore, but it wouldn't have added anything.
You'll be glad to know I'll probably include that in the credits.